Throughout September, Russia has been secretly attacking NATO. Russia would never admit it, of course, but there's no other way to describe Russia's decision to send drones and fighter jets into NATO territory several times during the course of the month. Russia hasn't declared outright war, but it's pushing boundaries and testing responses to see what NATO will do. Now, the true reason why Russia is secretly attacking NATO has finally been revealed, and that reason has come straight out of Vladimir Putin's mouth. On October 2nd, Censor.net reported on a speech that Putin gave at the Valdai Discussion Club in Russia. That club, which is named after Lake Valdai, was founded in 2004 and is essentially Russia's version of a think tank, much like RUSI or CSIS. Only, as you can probably guess, Valdai's opinions tend to amount to everything that Russia does is right and everything that the West does is wrong. Speakers and attendees include Putin himself, along with Kremlin cronies such as Dmitry Medvedev and Russia's former Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu. If unbiased thinking is what you want, Valdai isn't the club for you. It's essentially a mechanism through which the Kremlin can spread its propaganda. That's precisely what Putin did during his October speech, and in the process, he gave some twisted reasons for why Russia has started a secret war against NATO. To Putin, it all comes down to escalation. Only it's NATO that's doing the escalating, not Russia. Unfortunately, the hostilities in Ukraine have not yet been stopped, but responsibility for this lies primarily with Europe. Europe constantly escalates the conflict. They have no other goals. If NATO had not come closer to Russia's borders, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided. If Trump had been in power, the conflict could have been avoided. Censor.net reports Russia's president as claiming. What this essentially amounts to is Putin telling Valdai attendees that Russia is only attacking NATO now because NATO didn't simply allow him to take control of Ukraine. As is so often the case, Putin is creating his own version of history to justify his actions. We only need to go back to his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians to see examples of that. The entire essay is a Russia-favoring explanation of the supposed history between Russia and Ukraine that essentially amounts to Putin claiming that Ukraine isn't, and should never have been, a country. Perhaps that's what he's trying to claim at Valdai. In Putin's mind, Russia is trying to claim what should always have belonged to Russia. Never mind international treaties or Ukraine's independence, Russia has never fully acknowledged Ukraine's sovereignty, as Chatham House noted in August 2022. Russia at least acknowledged the existence of a border with Ukraine. However, only the land border was formally agreed upon in 2003, while the exact demarcation remained disputed. At the same time, the maritime boundaries in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait were never fully resolved. Putin took advantage of this fact, treating it as an opening to declare the war that rages today in an escalation beyond what many expected just half a decade ago. And yet, according to Putin, NATO is at fault for escalating. NATO should have stayed away from Russia's borders, which roughly translates to NATO should never have come near Ukraine. Because it did, Putin seems to be saying, Russia has had no choice but to start launching secret attacks against Europe. Note the use of the word secret. A secret attack isn't a secret if the nation doing the attack admits to what it's doing. So as soon as Putin accused NATO of escalation, he rubbished any suggestion that Russia is somehow responsible for any sort of attacks on NATO nations. Is Russia planning to attack NATO? Putin asked. This nonsense is impossible to believe. We have never initiated military confrontations ourselves, but if someone wants to challenge Russia, let them try. I would say, calm down, sleep well, and finally deal with your own problems. Here we see a classic case of Putin attempting to sow the seeds of disunity in Europe, all while denying that he's doing the very thing that everybody in Europe can see him doing. That sort of denial is par for the course when it comes to Russia, and it's parroted by many of Putin's cronies. As European leaders sound the alarm about Russia's drones and other provocations in the Baltic region, Newsweek said on October 2nd, Russia is trying to act like nothing is happening. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has even flatly stated that this is war in response to what Russia is doing. Tusk says that the rest of Europe, along with Poland, needs to abandon any illusion that Russia isn't fighting against NATO as we speak. Putin's response to all of this is that Europe is lying about what Russia is doing. The drone incursions, he says, aren't happening, and Europe is only making these accusations to inflame tensions to boost the defense spending. Again, none of this is Russia's fault. That's the message that Putin wants to send, at least to the people inside his own country, who might buy into the narrative that he's trying to create. Russia, if it's attacking NATO at all, which it isn't, is only doing so because Europe is making Russia do it. Europe got too close to Ukraine. Europe started spending record-breaking amounts of money on militarization. It's everybody else's fault except Russia's. Speaking of Europe's militarization, that's another reason that Putin gave for attacking NATO, even if he claims that Russia isn't doing just that by sending drones and fighter jets into NATO airspace. We are closely watching Europe's accelerating militarization. Either it is just talk, or it's time for us to take appropriate measures, Putin said. This quote, perhaps more than any other we've shared so far, reveals what Putin is really up to with the attacks on NATO nations. Those attacks are stopping just short of causing serious damage precisely because Putin is trying to feed into his narrative of NATO, and particularly European NATO, as an aggressor against which Russia has no choice but to fight. It doesn't matter that Europe is only militarizing to the extent that it is because of Russia's Ukraine invasion and the many hybrid warfare tactics Putin has used in Europe for years. It also doesn't matter that Europe getting too close to Russia, such as with Finland's and Sweden's decisions to join NATO, is only happening because of Putin's Ukraine invasion. What matters is that Putin can craft a narrative for his own people that everything that Russia does is always in response to an escalation by the enemy. All NATO countries are fighting us, and they're no longer hiding it, Putin also said during his speech. He then went on to claim that NATO troops are actually taking part in combat operations by supplying Ukraine with intelligence and weapons. It's a strange combination of whining about how NATO wouldn't let Putin do what he wants in Ukraine and more words that feed into the twisted narrative that is NATO and not Russia that caused the situation Europe now finds itself in. Europe's militarization is one of the escalations that Putin rallies against. Putin causes the problems and then he positions himself as the man who can solve them. Finally, as a coda to his speech, Putin flung himself into blatant hypocrisy by trying to show some semblance of sympathy to a country that he has spent over 3.5 years attempting to conquer. It's painful for Russians to watch the suffering of Ukraine's people, said a president who has happily ordered shelling and strikes that have cost the lives of more than 14,116 Ukrainian civilians, in addition to untold thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainian tragedy is a pain for Ukrainians, for Russians, for all of us, Putin concluded. A pain that Putin created. That, in a nutshell, is the real reason why Putin is launching secret attacks against NATO right now. Ultimately, it's what he always wanted to do, to the point where the Ukraine invasion could even be argued as a stepping stone for a later escalation of the fighting Putin wants to start with European NATO. Everything Putin said in his speech is indicative of a man who purposefully ignores the laws of cause and effect, or worse, twists those laws to his own ends. Anybody outside of Russia knows that Putin's agenda to invade Ukraine prompted the escalation of the tensions between Russia and NATO. However, Putin will tell you that the escalation only started when NATO started helping a sovereign nation that Russia had no right to invade. Putin falsely casts Russia as the victim. And it's this fake narrative of victimhood that ultimately provides Putin with the flimsy justification on which he bases all of his attacks against NATO. So the reasons for Russia's attacks, as Putin claims them to be, are hidden behind a veil of falsehood and bravado. It's only by cutting through that veil that we start to unveil the real reasons that Putin doesn't mention, rather than the reasons he uses to create his narrative. There are two of these reasons. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has already revealed the first. On October 2nd, Euromaidan Press reported on Zelensky's appearance at the 7th European Political Community (EPC) summit in Copenhagen. There, Zelensky laid out the first of Russia's reasons for launching his secret attacks against NATO. It's all about division, Zelensky claims. We all now live in a new reality, and I believe everyone understands this, even those who are not yet willing to admit it, Ukraine's president said at the conference. That mention of those who aren't willing to admit what's happening is a subtle way of saying that there is still a level of disunity inside European NATO when it comes to how to handle what Russia is doing. We saw an example of this division following Russia's sending at least 19 drones into Polish airspace. Though most Western intel officials seem to believe the drones were indeed Russian, some were questioning whether Russia intended to send them as recently as September 19th. That's according to CNN, which says that the intelligence gathered up to that point on the drones was mixed and difficult to interpret. That's the point. Putin's secret attacks on NATO, no matter how blatant they appear on the surface, still offer Russia enough plausible deniability for it to claim that they were never intended. Europe should calm down, stop getting hysterical, and though Putin would never say it, NATO should get bogged down in arguing amongst itself about whether such attacks carry intent and, if so, what NATO should do about them. When confusion reigns, Russia gains opportunities to do whatever it wants in Ukraine and Europe. Zelensky used the EPC stage in Copenhagen to caution against this divided approach. Recent drone incidents across Europe are a clear signal that Russia remains confident enough to expand this war, and it was never only about Ukraine. Russia has always sought to break the West, especially Europe, Zelensky claimed. Estonia's Minister of Defense, Hanno Pevkur, agrees with Zelensky. Speaking to the Express on October 2nd, Pevkur stated, "Russia is deliberately pushing all of us, the NATO allies, to deal with our own matters that we have here. Some air incidents and airspace violations, and then we have drone incidents, and then we have cyber attacks, and then there are Moldovan elections." Putin's suggestion that European nations should calm down, sleep well, and finally deal with your own problems takes on a new light here. Russia's leader basically confirms what Pevkur and Zelensky are saying. Russia is creating problems inside the territory of NATO members to force them to focus on those problems. In doing so, he takes attention away from what he's doing in Ukraine, and if everything works out as Putin hopes, can even create division within NATO as each nation affected by Russia's secret attacks tries to come up with its own way of dealing with them. After all, a country like Poland, which borders Ukraine and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, is going to be far more worried about drone incursions than a nation like France, which is far enough away to not have to be so concerned. That's the idea. Make one nation hysterical to cast it in a bad light to another nation that isn't so directly affected. Whether the approach is actually working or not isn't especially relevant. Putin is still using it, which gives us the real reason why he's launching secret attacks against NATO. The second reason is far more practical. Putin wants to test NATO. Pevkor lays out this second real reason clearly when speaking to the Express. Russia is testing how far they can go to destabilize society, Pevkor says. Is it okay to kill someone? Is it okay to disrupt the air traffic? Is it okay to disrupt the undersea cables? In other words, each of Russia's secret attacks against NATO is a test of how far Russia can push before it gets a real response. That doesn't mean NATO scrambling jets to escort Russian jets out of NATO airspace. That's been done before. Putin wants to figure out what he has to do to push a NATO nation so far that it strikes back. Why? Well, that would complete the narrative. Even one definitive attack on a Russian asset, regardless of whether that asset is in NATO airspace or not, would be all that Putin needs to send Russia's propaganda machine into overdrive. Again, this is something that Putin said without actually saying it during his speech. When he talks of Europe escalating and militarizing, what he's really saying is that he's using his secret attacks to prompt a not-so-secret attack that allows him to justify a much more direct response. Pevkor isn't the only one who thinks this is the case. Al Jazeera's Sarah Shamim posed the question of whether Russia was testing NATO with its drone incursions in a September 25th article. She noted that several European countries, including Poland, Estonia, Denmark, and Romania, have had to deal with Russia's secret attacks in September alone, and that the NATO response was to essentially threaten without following through. Charlie Edwards, who is the Senior Fellow for Strategy and National Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, adds to this. The recent incursions into NATO airspace suggest a calculated escalation, Edwards writes. Firstly, to identify potential vulnerabilities in NATO's air defenses, assess response times, and gauge the alliance's resolve. Secondly, to spread insecurity, sow disunity among allies, and erode public confidence in NATO's ability to protect its citizens. Thirdly, the drone incursions forced NATO to expend expensive missiles against low-cost drones that, if repeated at scale, would strain alliance inventories and budgets. Note the point about sowing disunity that we made earlier. Edwards also says that Russia may have been emboldened by America's seeming lack of interest in European security matters during the last months, giving Putin yet another reason to test his hand. NATO may just escort Russian aerial assets away, which shows Putin that NATO isn't ready for the fight Russia wants to start. Or a NATO nation goes on the attack, providing the propaganda fuel we've already discussed. Either way, Russia's leader comes out on top. His secret attacks achieve their real objectives. The question now is what NATO can do about all of this. One option is just to pierce the Russian veil by creating the united front that Putin has been trying to prevent. Zelensky made this point during his Copenhagen speech, claiming that all of those Putin targets should join the PURL initiative. This initiative not only supports us but also strengthens ties between Europe and the United States. The key is to remember that the root of the problem is Russia's war, Zelensky claimed. PURL is an initiative to enable partners to buy US systems used to protect Ukraine and Europe. It's all about unity, and Zelensky believes that investing heavily into that program will showcase how Europe is aware of what Putin is trying to pull and will fight against it via Ukraine. More direct fighting against Russia may also be required. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, said that NATO needs to be wary of delivering weak responses to Putin in the wake of the Polish drone incursions. This situation shows that finally the decision needs to be taken to enable partner air defense capabilities in neighboring countries to be used to intercept drones and missiles in the Ukrainian airspace, including those approaching NATO borders, Sybiha wrote on X. Several in NATO support this approach, including Poland, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering Poland's warning to Russia. US President Donald Trump has also suggested that it may be time for NATO nations to start shooting Russia's jets and drones down, assuming they enter NATO territory. This direct approach carries the risk of playing right into Putin's attempts to spin a narrative, as we've already explained. However, it may also send a message that Russia's president doesn't want to hear. NATO isn't messing around anymore. If Russia is using secret attacks, NATO will thwart them publicly and then call out Putin with the evidence of what really happened. More sanctions are also an option if NATO wants to go down the indirect response route. The EU is already putting together its 19th sanctions package against Russia, which will place more economic pressure on Putin. The strategy here could be to continue supporting Ukraine. perhaps through the PURL initiative, while also draining Russia's war machine to the point where a direct response against Putin's aggression won't be needed at all. Zelensky supports this approach, especially when it comes to dealing with Russia's shadow fleet. Russia continues to use tankers despite sanctions. This must be stopped. Additional sanctions are needed against captains, crews, and owners of the shadow fleet companies, Ukraine's president said in Copenhagen. Yet more sanctions won't stop Russia's secret attacks, but they will limit Putin's ability to conduct them, especially if they're combined with more support for Ukraine. Finally, NATO, particularly its European members, may have no other option but to prepare for a future war. Creating a drone wall that covers NATO's eastern flank is one of the ways to do that, and it's an idea that Euronews says has achieved broad support from several EU leaders. This approach would see NATO take on a defensive posture, forcing Putin to get bolder with his secret attacks, as they would need to break through a barrier before they reached NATO territory. Could this be a way to play Putin at his own game? To force Putin into making an actual and very public attack to start the war that he wants? We can only wait and see what the drone wall ends up being, assuming it's approved. We've created a video covering what the drone wall might end up looking like and how it could be something that Putin can't stop. Check out that video to learn more about this tactic for countering Russia's aggression. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's latest efforts to provoke NATO. And thank you, as always, for watching.